views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Straight ahead on this edition of Perspectives, Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron filed a motion asking the judge to dismiss the request by the grand juror in the Breonna Taylor case. He said in a statement, grand jury proceedings are kept confidential by legal precedent to protect the safety and anonymity of those involved. Well, coming up on this edition, we tackle the legality of the case as well as the grand jury's decision. That's up next on this edition of Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let them know.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime. Of course, we thank you for watching. And as always, you can watch Perspectives every week here on Bronx's Channel 67. If you have Verizon Files, we welcome you. You're watching on Channel 2133 or anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. We also want to thank you for sharing again on social media platforms, BronxNet TV. If you're looking to get in touch with me, DC Jaime 23 on Twitter and Instagram. My professional page on Facebook, Daren C. Jaime. There you'll find some information as well as some possible inspiration. Well, coming up front and center on the show, we talk about the Breonna Taylor case, the shooting of Breonna Taylor by Louisville police officers in March during a raid on her apartment led to nationwide demonstrations as the case drew national and worldwide attention. There was even more unrest. A grand jury indicted one of the officers in late September for his actions during the raid, but no charges were filed against any of the two officers who also fired shots. No one was charged for the death of Mrs. Taylor, and after audio recordings from the grand jury proceedings were released in October, many are still left baffled by the decision. Here to talk more about this is criminal defense attorney who's represented thousands of clients and litigated countless cases to acquittal. She has more than a decade of experience as a public defender in the South Bronx. Ms. Jodi Morales. And Jodi, good to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I think the question that's on the hearts and minds of most people across the world worldwide is, did Breonna Taylor really get justice with all that we see?
I think the short answer is absolutely not. And that's both from a human perspective as well as a criminal defense perspective. I think if we really dissect what transpired there and how the district attorney responded, we see a huge miscarriage of justice here. Now, no one is saying that officers shouldn't have the ability to carry out, their responsibilities and the things that they have to do. However, the manner in which these responsibilities were carried out was extremely negligent, actually illegal, okay, completely illegal. And to see at this juncture such a light indictment or a light, charge put before the grand jury is just another miscarriage of justice.
I want to bring some recent findings, some recent notes. Newly released documents from the internal investigations by Louisville, Kentucky police on the shooting death of Breonna Taylor actually show that even after the protests erupted nationwide and the case had been turned over to a special prosecutor, the police department was actively gathering negative information about Breonna Taylor's boyfriend. And then Brett Hankinson, who's one of the detectives on the scene, who actually fired into the sliding glass patio door in the window of Breonna Taylor's apartment, was guilty of a violation of departmental policy that requires officers to have a line of sight. Now, he's only one of three officers who's actually dismissed from the force, and I'll talk about that termination letter a little bit later on. But when we see only one of three officers actually dismissed, and we see this gentleman who's actually dismissed for actually shooting into an apartment rather than shooting Breonna Taylor to death. I think that's a big problem, Jodi, because I think that a lot of people are saying, listen, the apartment got more justice than Breonna Taylor did.
Absolutely. And I'll say this is something that has struck me from the beginning. I see this all the time in practice. I have clients who are charged under a theory of acting in concert with other defendants, right? You'll have three people charged and accused of one act, but all three are said to have shared the same intent. In listening to the story unfold and the facts unfold, it seems pretty clear to me that all three officers that let off shots into this apartment should have been equally indicted on more serious charges, not taken outside of this entire grouping, when in fact, I mean, it's very clear that the purpose and the goal of even going into that apartment was a shared goal, right? To execute a search warrant. So yes, the apartment is getting way more justice here than a human being who lost her life in a very tragic and unjustifiable way.
Talk to me about the grand jury. A lot of people are concerned about that, and some people need some more insight into that. Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron making a grand jury, or putting the information before the grand jury, and then that juror now comes back and says, listen, we didn't get all the information that's being said right now. If we got that, potentially a different outcome. Talk to us about the weight that the Attorney General has, in particular in a grand jury case.
Yeah, I mean, they have all of the power and all of the weight, right? They're the ones who are charged with bringing in the evidence, with bringing in the witnesses, with putting the information in front of the jurors who are potentially going to vote for an indictment or not vote for an indictment. And so this is why the role of the prosecutor is so important in our criminal justice system, and why, from an ethical perspective, we have to be a lot more discerning with whom we are putting in those positions, right? Because as we've seen in this case, there was information that was selectively chosen not to be presented in front of these jurors. How could they have come to, a just decision without having all of the evidence put before them? It wouldn't happen. And the sad part is that this is not unique to Breonna Taylor's case. This happens day in and day out in courtrooms and jurisdictions across the country.
And I think that's a lot why you see the nationwide protests. First of all, the gruesomeness in which occurred, the no-knock warrant ending in somebody's life who had no criminal background. This was the wrong apartment, wrong time, wrong place. And yet and still, we find that this is a similar situation when it comes to the grand jury, when it comes to no-knock warrants and mistakes made. I think about the case of Eleanor Bumpers back in the day. A lot of people say, listen, this is just a microcosm of a macrocosm. If we're looking at this situation and trying to push it forward, and we say, can anything still be done? Because now that this has happened and no charges are being filed, is there any possibility or recourse for justice for Breonna Taylor?
That's a tough question. I think that people need to continue to mobilize behind her name, her legacy, and potentially push for stronger legislation to completely do away with no-knock warrants in every jurisdiction, right? I mean, right now, it's very, very hard to say. We can reopen the case. They can decide to, or rather reopen the grand jury presentation and decide to put more evidence before the jurors. But that in and of itself is going to be met with a lot of pushback, right? Because we have the police department and we have the prosecutor's office who doesn't want to, at this point, look like they did anything wrong. I mean, that's why they're digging up information on, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend and that sort of thing. What I can say in terms of moving forward from a macro perspective is, people need to get more involved in voting. And, we have a big election year, but it's not sufficient to just vote in the presidential elections. People have to turn out to the polls when prosecutors are being elected. These are people who actually have a direct impact on our communities and on our lives. And I think, unfortunately, we don't do enough.
Coming up on the next segment, talk a little bit about knowing your rights. I want to take a quick break with Jodi. And we'll be back with more right here on Perspectives.
I'm Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr., and I'm making sure that the Bronx counts is my priority. That's why I'm urging everyone to fill out the 2020 census. The 2020 census is important because it would allow for the federal government to determine how much money and resources the Bronx is going to need for the next 10 years around healthcare, education, housing, roads, representation, and so many other things. What does it mean exactly? Just imagine. Imagine if you are organizing a party or an event and you send out 100 invitations, but only 50 people RSVP, and you only prepare for 50 people, and yet 100 people showed up. You're gonna be short of food, seats, tables, chairs. That's why it is important that 100% of us here in the Bronx fill out the 2020 census. It is easy, it is confidential, it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or undocumented. We need everybody to fill it out. Now let's all get together and make the Bronx count.
Welcome back here to Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you. We are guest in studio, Jodi Morales. We're talking about the Breonna Taylor death and the charges against officers, and also the nationwide uprising that has followed subsequently. And Jodi, glad to have you sharing with us as we continue our conversation. I think on the hearts and minds of most people nationwide and worldwide is when there's something regarding the police department, there's always this question about whether or not justice will be served. And anybody knows that when you have a run-in with the police, whether it leads to the place like this or whether it's a simple traffic stop, you always hear the words, we're going to have our day in court. But when we get to court, we find that things don't always work out that way. So what can a person do to arm themselves better for when they have incidents involving police so that they're ready for court?
I've always said the same thing, right? I mean, our initial reaction when dealing with police officers is always anxious. It's always, scary, right? And sometimes that causes people to overreact or maybe underreact in the sense of not complying with very, small requests such as providing your pedigree information. And there isn't a one size fits all answer. But what I can say is that if you are approached by a police officer, do not do anything that's going to hurt your case moving forward. In other words, making statements is never a good idea. Resisting, even when you feel like you're being overpowered in a way that you shouldn't be, resisting is another factor that comes into play at a trial or even before the trial where, it's ammunition for the prosecutor to say, this person was acting in a rowdy manner or wasn't complying in the way that he or she was supposed to do. And so, again, the basic and most important advice I can give is to try to remain calm, provide pedigree information, and don't make any statements, because that'll allow your defense attorney to form a stronger, better defense for you as the case unfolds.
And when we look in the case of Breonna Taylor, obviously somebody says, you have someone who's now deceased. You have a boyfriend that ends up, in custody for a minute. Questions are still being asked about whether or not what went on actually there. How do you go about as a family? If you're a family, and say for instance you're the attorney for the family, what are some of the things if I'm a family member that I could actually do to help to assist to bolster the case so that way I can give my deceased loved one a voice?
I mean, I think the most important thing any family member could do is to remain vigilant in terms of following the story as it unfolds on the media, as well as being in contact with the attorney representing the family consistently, right? You want to start doing your homework and you want to be as much a part of the case as possible. And, many times these situations are a surprise to us, and we don't have the legal background or knowledge. And it's great to have an attorney, but there's, no better way to support or show support for your family member than to actually dive in and try to learn these concepts for yourself.
Yeah. A lot's going on today, particularly in the criminal justice system. And amidst COVID, I want to just switch gears for a moment and just have an opportunity to talk to you because for a lot of people, particularly yourself as an attorney, COVID-19 has had that particular impact where we're not necessarily in the courtroom. I know the courtroom is just kind of like opening up right now.
Right.
What's it been like for you post-COVID, well, in COVID-19, post-COVID-19, in the fact of, helping your clients out? Because it's been a huge adjustment.
It's very challenging, to say the least. Some of my cases are being heard in person and some are being heard in virtual court. And as you can imagine, virtual court doesn't afford you the opportunity to speak to your client without potentially having that conversation be heard by the court and other people. And of course, confidences are of the utmost importance when you're dealing with criminal law. So it's been very, very challenging. The other challenging aspect of it is that cases have been at a standstill. And so under normal circumstances, cases that lingered for too long would have been dismissed. That's not happening here. So we're seeing a lot of cases linger for a very long period of time, which obviously impacts our clients in a negative fashion. And so, there are adjustments. I understand that these things had to happen in the way that they did, meaning, we had to close down courts and we had to shift over to these other avenues. But, it's not without, considering that some of our clients' rights have been infringed by the pandemic.
Yeah. Has the court determined the priority system in terms of how they shall deal with the cases in the calendars?
So yes and no. Some courts are prioritizing the very old cases, and some courts are prioritizing the very old cases where the clients are incarcerated. It really is dependent on the judge and what that courtroom is seeing in terms of numbers of cases. I know that trials are resuming, but whether prospective jurors are going to feel comfortable following through with their duty during COVID and having to be in closed quarters with other people, that's something I see as a huge challenge. And I don't know whether we're going to be able to actually begin trials and see them all the way through.
And also that disclaimer needs to be put out there too about arraignments. They're still happening all day, every day.
They sure are. Arraignments have not stopped. They are happening from the lawyer's perspective. We are not in person, but certainly if you're arrested, you are going to be processed in the normal manner and you are going to be brought to court and held in a holding pen until it's time to see the judge.
Yeah. So arraignments are happening. Regular court is happening. And your concern, give me a little bit about your concern about jury trials, because if you've got a case that needs to go to a jury with all of this still not, complete with regards to social distancing and figuring out, and also the possible reoccurrence of a potential new spike, where do you think this puts the calendar? Where do you think this puts your clients?
I think it puts our clients at a disadvantage. I mean, the jury is the most important part of a criminal trial. They're the decision makers, right? The fact finders. Unfortunately, I think that this pandemic is going to be weighing on the minds of jurors. And if you want to have a fair shot in court, you can't have a juror sitting there whose attention is divided or who is concerned about a health concern instead of paying attention to the facts of your case. And I think even the most, open juror, even the most, considerate juror is going to have that in the back of their minds. I think it's very hard to ignore that we are living under very, very difficult times from a public health perspective. So I'm very concerned about jurors' ability to pay attention and perform the function that they are supposed to perform.
Let me take a quick break and come back with you more with Jodi with our last segment. We are watching Perspectives. Jodi Morales, our guest in the studio with us here, or I should say virtual studio, coming to us here on Perspectives. We'll be right back in a few, right after that.
It looks bleak. It feels bleak. But the city isn't shut down because our public services keep working, in spite of and in the face of the dangers. We can count on them. And to keep them working and funded now and in the future, we need to be counted. Self-respond now to the 2020 census at my2020census.gov.
And we're back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you. We are talking with Jodi Morales, who is a criminal defense attorney who has been working in the field for more than a decade, defending those thousands of cases. And Jodi, I want to talk to you about this perspective going back to the Breonna Taylor case. We know that the family received a settlement from the city of Louisville for $12 million. Some people have asked the question about the civil part, right? You've got a criminal part, but then you've got a civil part. And some people are saying, why do people settle civilly before sometimes things are even done criminally? Can you give us some insight into that?
Sure. I mean, there isn't a right or wrong way to do it. It really is dependent on the facts of the case. Perhaps the number that was proposed was, sufficient to the family, given the other aspects of the case that, not all of us are aware of. But, in my practice, typically, if someone is wrongfully arrested, we put the city on notice right away that we intend to sue. And, within just a couple of months, there's a hearing, and then the city's attorneys will propose an early settlement. And really, it is the preference of the client. I mean, if there is a number that's proposed that avoids, prolonged or protracted litigation and, satisfies them based on the facts of the case and they accept it, then, it's closed, it's over. However, if the number is too short, then or too small, we then push it forward to trial. That doesn't mean that it will actually go to trial. There are other times and other opportunities to engage in settlement negotiations. But, it really is just a matter of preference.
Yeah. When we break down the settlement, Breonna Taylor, the city of Louisville, is settling for $12 million. Beyond the fact that she died and she was, and she was killed in her apartment, the question says, when you give out a $12 million settlement on the part of the city of Louisville, that pretty much states that something went terribly wrong and somebody's at fault.
Well, I think yes and no, right? Okay. I mean, the whole purpose of a settlement negotiation is to, avoid litigation, to avoid the expense of litigation. I'm sure that before that number was proposed, there was a careful consideration of all factors by Kentucky, the city of Louisville, and, their determination was, rather than go to trial and waste all of this money from our perspective, let's, put this money before the family. Sure, maybe they were worried that there were aspects of the case that would result in a larger finding by a jury. But it's a little hard to tell without having all of the facts in front of us. Certainly, in my opinion, I think $12 million was very low, given the tragedy that happened here and just given the sort of outrageous facts as they unfolded. But that's a personal decision that the family had to make, and it's a decision that most people who file these suits have to carefully consider.
Right. So when you have a case that is criminal and it goes civil, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the determining factors in making a criminal case actually go civil?
So it's not necessarily that the case is transferred from criminal court to civil court. It's almost like a concurrent, the case is concurrently going on in two different places. In other words, I can have the criminal case pending here, but, where my client is the defendant and charged with a crime, but that person has been wronged and that person wants to, pursue a civil suit against the other party. So both cases can be going on at the same time. In many situations, what happens is the criminal case, it's dismissed first, and then the civil suit, proceeds, again, if there isn't a settlement. But it isn't one or the other. And particularly in this case, it was in tandem.
Yeah. What can we expect to see coming in the court system down the line? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of concern on the part of attorneys, particularly in New York City, about the future, even with the potential of possibly a second wave and this influenza that's going on. Talk to me a little bit about your concerns and what you see happening coming forward.
My biggest concern now are my clients who are lingering in jail without having their days in court. I think that most criminal practitioners are feeling the same sort of weight. We're hearing our clients call us in desperation, talking about the horrible conditions in the prisons and the lack of, PPE, lack of, medical care. And these are things that I think are going to take a very long time to correct. Obviously, we were already dealing with, or not we, but my clients were already dealing with unsanitary and safe conditions prior to the pandemic. Now that's been, heightened to the 10th power. I think that, as things change, we as litigators and attorneys have to take those things into consideration and push even harder for things like compassionate release, push even harder for variances in sentencing, and draw specifically to the COVID pandemic as a reason why judges need to be a little bit more lenient with our constituents who are in prisons.
And Jodi, if somebody's out there watching before we go and they need to get in touch with you via, they've got a case or possibly a potential case, what do they do?
Well, they can go on my website. It's www.jlmoraleslaw.com. They can also call 646-582-0400, and I'm happy to help.
All right, Jodi. Well, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for giving us some insight. I think we all have a deeper understanding as to, intent, minds, and how things actually play out. Jodi, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All righty. Jodi Morales, our guest here on Perspectives. I want to thank her for joining us, and I want to thank you for watching as well. And as always, you can stay connected to us here on Perspectives. As we said, Bronx says Channel 67, Verizon Files, Channel 2133. And don't forget, always, the web, bronxnet.org. For all of our staff here on Perspectives, Daren Jaime saying take care, God bless, and most of all, share your perspective with somebody else you don't know. It just might make a difference in someone else's life. We'll catch you next week.